Hi, I'm Kevin Jick, a concept artist specializing in environments. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm excited to show you how to create this Japanese mountainside village scene using Blender, a kitbash set I created, and Photoshop. I will also be showing you tips and tricks on how I like to create concept art and the concept art process. In this tutorial we'll cover an overview of the concept art process, like why are you making this, the idea, and what are you going to make, reference gathering, sketching, 3D blockout, and finally the Photoshop paint over. I'm currently a senior environment concept artist working in the games industry. I've worked with companies such as Naughty Dog, Treyarch, NetEase, and more. And I'm also a teacher at Artstation Academy. I love teaching, and if you are interested in a more long-form video where I cover in detail how to make a Japanese village scene in Blender, you can check out my Artstation marketplace, where I also have this Japanese village kit available for purchase. This Japanese Village Kitbash set is designed for artists looking to quickly and easily create Japanese-themed scenes using Blender. This set includes a wide variety of optimized assets that capture traditional Japanese architecture and props. It's now available on my Artstation store. Check the link in the description for more details. And with that, let's get started. So the first question you can ask yourself is, why are you making this? What do you want to get out of this? Is this for your portfolio? Is this more of a practice piece you want to practice composition or design, 3D or sketching? So this is important for setting yourself up in the best way possible. The way you approach each of these would be different. So let's say you're going to make a portfolio piece or you're going to practice making a portfolio piece. You first would need to start with your idea. So step 2 would be the idea. What are you going to make? For environments, I like to ask myself some questions like, what is it? Where is it? And when is it? Who lives here? Why do they live here? What do they do here? What cultures are they inspired by? What regions of the world would they live in? Is it cold? Is it tropical? How do they get around? So these questions will help narrow down what you're making. And when you answer these questions early on, it'll help solve certain design, like story, mood, or like even compositional elements. And it'll just make it easier in general. Once you have your general idea, it's time to get some references. So reference gathering is extremely important. It's good to gather references for the different aspects of your concept, things like architecture references, culture references, mood or time of day, as well as references for specific types of props you might use in the environment. So, and things with lots of design, you might also have references for your design language as well. So for example, for this project, I was looking at a lot of references for villages that can be found on cliff sides, things like that. It doesn't really need to be for specific cultures because you can get references that just inspire you with the shapes, how they're built onto cliff sides. All this stuff can be really important, and if you swap it out, for example, with me would be like the Japanese village kit, then I can kind of just like take these compositions, I can take just the general idea of how they're built into the cliff sides, and then I could swap it out and change it, and then it becomes my own unique thing. You can even use abstract references for composition inspirations too. So what if you built your Japanese village kit, for example, on the sides of these vertical cliffs with parts that are sticking out? That would be really interesting. You'd have to ask yourself, how do they get around? Why would they be doing this? Maybe they have rope bridges that go across, or they use like hang gliders to get around, something like that. But you could use these abstract references too for composition, because once you change the scale and the story behind it, it could be really interesting. I also knew that I would be using a lot of wooden support beams for how the parts of my village would be on the mountainside. So here's just some general references for that. And I also knew that it would be important to get the feeling of movement. And I also like the sound aspect. So things like wind chimes and bells would be a really great sound cue, and birds flying, birds on buildings, that would be just really awesome for a village high up in the mountains. So I'm also getting references for mood, as I mentioned earlier. So that kind of foggy time of day, it's a little bit cold, would be perfect for me. There's not like a lot of direct sunlight, but you might get pockets of direct sunlight. And so this real world reference combined with references from this concept art from Roman from Ghost of Tsushima, as well as this screenshot, I think give me a perfect starting point to go with. So after you got your references, it's time for some sketches. This is a great step to practice some ideas before fully committing to something. Get your ideas out in a loose, rough state. This can be just for yourself. for personal pieces of mine, I tend to not show these sketches because they're not showy or pretty. This is just for personal exploration where I like to try things out. But if you're making portfolio images, it is important to show your sketching. So I would spend a bit more time on your sketches and make them a bit more presentable. And you can be inspired by references for composition and design, as I mentioned earlier. So use this stage to narrow down your direction before going into your 3D blockout. And here I'm playing around with different sketching styles, using silhouette shapes to kind of emphasize just the overall shape and think about it like that, and then adding a second value to kind of like be a line drawing inside of the shape. I find this also pretty helpful at trying out different compositions. It works extremely well, I find, for like large epic scale structures and how you can like layer atmosphere in between the layers. And then here's also another type of composition sketching where it's focusing more on just black and white and more graphic shapes. So you use the smudge tool to smudge some edges, and then you can kind of just focus on light and dark read and very graphic. These different kinds of sketching styles will produce different results, which is really fun. And then I'll do a few more of these line drawing sketches to kind of keep figuring out the idea. And I won't necessarily pick an exact one for one in this stage, but I kind of know what I want. And I know that when I jump into the 3D, I'll be able to fine tune things pretty much how I want. And then here are the wrapped up sketches for this round. They are not super pretty, but they are rough. They're getting my idea across. I kind of would just keep them to myself. It takes a bit of time, but already I can try out a lot of variations and kind of know which direction to go in. And even just like a slight value pass underneath some of them, just to kind of test the value ranges, the misty feeling, trying to make it feel cold even in a value sketch. And this will be very helpful moving forward. So here we are starting with the 3D blockout. This is the kitbash phase. I have my sketches done, so I'm going to be grabbing elements from my kit and building it out, just blocking it out similar to the sketches. Using a figure for scale is helpful, and this is why having the sketches before was so nice, because I have a general foundation of what I'm going to be doing, how I'm going to be blocking it out, and what to do. Sometimes if you've ever jumped into 3D like I have in the past, then you get frustrated halfway through because you didn't have a good enough foundation, you're moving things around too much. Really spending that time, even if it's just like an hour, 2 hours on the sketching phase, is just so helpful, because you could spend between 4 and 8 hours in the 3D phase, maybe even longer, and then even the paint over phase can take a while. So it's really helpful just to spend a bit of time on sketching. And here, since I have all the elements pretty much made ahead of time, I'm just taking them, kind of arraying them, moving them into camera view to try to just like get as close as I can to those sketches. And since I'm using 3D, I can kind of use the 3D to my advantage here. I can move things, push and pull things, kind of create, for me, a bit more overlap and depth, which is nice. I use Botanic as a tree add-on. I find it really great. I know there's a few of them out there, but I use the full Botanic. It's a little pricey initially, but it's really, really great. I have a few add-ons I use, but I actually don't use very many. I tend to do things kind of out of the box, but I use Botanic, and then this is the second one. It is Pro Lighting Skies. It's quite a good built-in HDRI add-on, essentially. And so I'll use that for the general lighting, the fill light, And then I will create some small area lights here just for like those pockets of light. Since it's kind of getting darker, putting in some lights like lanterns will be look really good. And I have a few methods for doing these kind of like arrays, these kind of piers that people would walk on. So that one is using the array and just manually placing it around. And then later I'll go into using a curves, which I have set up in the Kitbash site also. Here I'm putting in some characters. Definitely they add a lot of life to the scene, a lot of life and scale, which is nice, add extra story. And I got these costumes from the Daz 3D Marketplace. I've recently been using Daz and Character Creator for kind of characters, costumes, and posing, and I've come to really like it. It does mean though that you have to buy the costumes, so that can be a little bit of an investment, but it definitely can save a lot of time. And if for those of you who like to paint or photo bash or really good at like Marvelous Designer though, I know that you can get like really amazing results that way. So it really depends on what you prefer. And then another add-on, cable arrayer for some cables, which would just be rope here. I'm going to use these kind of like poles with rope hanging, and I'm going to attach some bells and wind chimes to them for some of that sound, noise, and wind kind of mentioned earlier. That'll kind of help give more life to the scene. However you can show something in movement or in motion will really help. And here I'm extending a first curve array. So I'm going to attach the pier with an array and then a curve modifier to that so that you can kind of like easily just array it across, which I find really, really helpful. And then I can even create for some of my supports, I can use that same curve and attach it. Here's a small jump forward. I'm adjusting the lighting here. I've made the scene a little darker overall. And now I'm adding point lights to the different lanterns to help give it a bit more glow. Here's a second curve array with the overhead piers. It just makes it so much easier to array things across. And here I'm going to be adding on a railing onto the same curve, so it's easy to kind of duplicate it around. Here I'm using some Megascan rock assets to kind of update the previous assets. I was noticing in the previous ones, it could have a bit more depth to them, so some of these other ones I'm laying on top have like a little bit better scale. And some just general adjustments. There's a lot of rope here, so it's going to need a lot of adjusting. Grabbing another item from my Kitbash set, a barrel, and then here's like a quick showing off of how I made some of the flags that are available in the set. Just essentially using the wind dynamic on cloth modifiers, and then essentially I made a bunch of these and then merged them so I can have a bunch to play around with. As well, this kind of movement will really help a lot with the set. And I made a few different types, so here's me kind of adding them in. So a fun addition to the scene to add movement and scale are birds. I got these from Sketchfab. They're really, really cool scans, and they help add a lot. So a few different varieties kind of placed around the scene, grouped together, will kind of give it a lot of life, which I really appreciate. Even some bird nests for fun. Those are little details that I'm just doing for myself. I don't think anyone who's seeing this will probably notice it. I enjoy those kind of details. It really immerses myself in the world. And here's the final render for our scene. Now I'm going to be taking this into Photoshop, and I'm going to be taking it in with a mist pass and a bloom pass. This is just going to help with the Photoshop compositing. I also have a little trick about how to kind of render out different layers, because that is what I'm going to be using to add atmosphere in between the layers. So let's say I have my camera here in Blender and I'm at 1100 meters. What if I wanted just a section of this rendered? So I can drop down go to the camera and then go to the end. And so this will kind of like change how much is being shown. And as you can see here, there's parts that are getting outlined. So let's say I really wanted a render right around here because I know I can add atmosphere behind here. And essentially I don't want to lasso in Photoshop. I got my end tool. I make sure my volume is turned off. I go to film, camera film, and then make sure transparent is on. And then essentially I do a render. I'll like lower the samples down to something low and I'll do a render. And now this can be a mask that essentially I can use to add atmosphere behind. And as you can see here, I'm separating some of the layers using those masks to help with that process. And now I can start adding some skies. Sometimes I work foreground to background. Sometimes I'll work background to foreground. So for this one, I decided to go from back to front, kind of update those skies, make sure we get that kind of like foggy, moody weather and cloudy, cold, adding in some clouds and atmosphere. And I miss using atmospheric brushes for this. I find those to be extremely good. Sometimes I'll use photos to kind of like especially get some certain edges, but I feel like with the brushes I can really get more of a gesture and shape down. This whole first stage will be adding a lot of atmosphere in, and then I can start painting and simplifying, tweaking atmosphere, tweaking lighting. Where can I use atmospheric separation? Where can I use lighting and value separation? Where can I use paint to kind of like for separation? Those are kind of the questions I'm asking. Using a little bit of value to kind of like darken some things that I could simplify. Yeah, I don't want everything to be lit super evenly, so I'll intentionally vignette or darken some areas. So as if like cloud shadows are there, but essentially you just, when everything's lit super evenly, then it can feel flat. And that's kind of like a big goal for something like this, is to really not make it flat. And so lighting, atmosphere, as things go in and out of light will really help. Here is some simplification. So some of these tree shapes are kind of too noisy. There's a little bit too much contrast. Same thing with some of these edges. These edges, what you won't get from Blender are soft edges. So you need to do that in Photoshop. Find where you can soften and paint out edges. And this is something that you will kind of like work at for a while. You can choose where to soften edges and where to keep them sharp for extra contrast. You don't want to keep the 3D render perfectly as is. You want to edit it and adjust it. Use illustration techniques to kind of amplify the look of it, especially if that's kind of what you're going for, a more like illustrated finish. One thing I like to do as a layer on top, I'll kind of call it a highlight layer, use linear dodge, and I'll paint in kind of like a little bit of extra lighting to kind of like emphasize things. Blender renders extremely well. The lighting, it looks really good, but I'll use this to kind of like rim light certain things, paint additional lighting, make sure like especially like top surfaces or surfaces that might be getting hit by light, I'll kind of like emphasize it more, and it'll help certain areas pop in front of other areas. Just giving a little bit more form to some of these objects. Here's a bit more painting and simplifying. And now finally adding in some birds. So this will help a ton with scale, add a lot of movement. This was kind of the plan, and so using Photoshop is the perfect way to do this. It's easy to move them around, use some atmosphere to push them back, color correct them, mask them in and out where needed. I kind of did a few passes at this. So I kind of changed up the birds here, duplicating the same bird group and then cutting some off, moving some, deleting some, masking some out is kind of the way I want to do it. And then even different birds for the ones that are kind of flying a little bit closer to camera. You can go in and just edit it as much as you want. Here's some more atmosphere tweaking, and now it'll come down to a lot more simplifying. So kind of simplifying and softening that edge, painting it up a bit, finding those holes were kind of too contrasty, so I can just reduce the contrast there by painting them up, painting over some of the rock shapes. Even up here, painting over stuff. Essentially now I'm trying to figure out what are not the focal areas and then reducing the contrast there and reducing some of the sharp edges and the areas that aren't my main focal points, so I can just kind of paint them out. And I don't merge things. I keep everything on like a new layer so it's all non-destructible, so I can always go back to it and erase it, take it out, adjust it as needed. And then even finding like value wise, I could push that mountain back a little bit more. It was drawing a little bit too much attention. Going back to tweak some of the atmosphere, finding that I can add a little bit of depth here by punching holes, doing that. And then again, going back to more of a painting pass. Some of the birds were getting lost, and by kind of emphasizing the light on the top of them, we can kind of separate them a bit more. So even if you don't see them right away, if you were to like zoom in or look at it, you'll kind of get the impression that there's like overlapping shapes there. Even painting some of the top surfaces, especially making sure it's getting hit by bounce light or by the warm lights. So here I'm going to be doing the final color adjustments. So essentially I use an overlay layer where essentially I paint in with black and white to really push and pull the lights and darks. I'll sometimes use a threshold or a cutout just to double check some values. I'll use camera raw filter a bit where I can push and pull values. Sometimes I'll use it for a little bit for color adjustments. You can add a little vignetting here, and then I'll oftentimes reduce the opacity where I see fit for something like that. I'll also use color lookup tables. Those are great to use on a normal layer or on a color layer and flip through it, reduce the opacity where needed. You can get a lot of options with that. And then another little trick is if you copy merged everything and you go to image, you have auto tone, auto contrast, and auto color. And those are pretty amazing. They give you different varieties and variations. So here's how the final looks. I had a ton of fun making this one, starting from the early ideas, references, sketching, 3D and paint over. It was also really fun using this Kitbash set I made. And if you are interested in checking it out for yourself or for more information about it, you can go to my Artstation store page. Link will be down in the description. This set is for Blender, whether you are using 3-point something or 4-point something, it will work for that. I also had a lot of fun putting this together, and I have some more ideas for future videos. I was not able to go into everything in this one, and I'm curious for those who watched, if you had anything you want me to discuss more of or dive into. Just thanks so much for watching.